Hello and welcome to the Scottsdale Heritage Connection Center at Scottsdale Civic Center Library. I'm community historian Joan Fudala, and today I'm going to be talking about Scottsdale's fabulous restaurant history. But it's important to say that I'm talking to you on April 17th, 2020, when Scottsdale, the United States, and the entire world are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also known as the coronavirus pandemic. Our schools are closed, our businesses are temporarily closed, and we've been asked to social distance to prevent further spread of this new disease. And unfortunately, many of our restaurants are only open for carry-out or delivery service, and we're all so anxious for our restaurants to be open again so that we can enjoy them. In the words of Goldie Hawn and Private Benjamin, I don't know about you, but I want to go out to lunch. Anyway, in that regard, before we get on to the actual restaurant history, I would really like to dedicate this talk to the restaurant owners and employees, as well as the grocery store workers who are so eager to serve us again, whether it be at the restaurant or at the takeout counter, so they can see us in person and serve us up our favorite dishes. But I hope you'll see in the next few minutes that Scottsdale is and always has been a delicious destination with the world's greatest restaurants. And I also hope for those of you that have lived in Scottsdale for a while that this will also help you remember some of our favorite restaurants of the past. So Scottsdale was founded in 1888 as a farming and ranching community, quite different from the Scottsdale that we know today. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1930s that we actually had a few cafes. So we really relied on the fresh produce that was coming from our farms. In fact, even our founder and namesake, Winfield Scott, was a prolific farmer and also the first food PR person, where he, as soon as he had a successful crop, whether it was the citrus that was being grown, grapes, figs, apricots, peanuts, almonds, peaches, oats, as well as dairy cattle that he had on his farm. And then in years following Winfield Scott, where we became a major cattle ranching area, the beef that was raised here, all of this made Scottsdale a producer of great food that led to our, hopefully, our soon-to-be born restaurant industry. And also this leads me to say that the term locavore that so many people use now, which means locally sourced produce for food in restaurants, seems to be the current buzzword, but actually it's been in Scottsdale for over 130 years because we certainly were voracious producers and eaters of locally produced food. In addition to being a citrus center, particularly in what we now know as the Arcadia area, we also were a producer of dates, and that was also predominant in the Arcadia area. And we still have one date center here, and that's on Scottsdale Road, the Sphinx Date Palm shop, so that's still a tie to our earlier days. So in the early 1900s, the main source of eating out meant eating outside, and that was picnics. Again, there were no restaurants or cafes here in Scottsdale until the late 1920s and early 1930s. So if you wanted to eat out, you put a picnic basket together and you went out in the desert. And people were quite inventive and adventurous then. They'd have picnics at Hole in the Rock in what we now know as Papago Park. They would take a picnic up to Echo Canyon, or they would have a big picnic spread out in their backyard. And one of the favorite places in the 1890s and early 1900s to have a picnic was the entire town, which was not even 100 people at that time, would gather at the Winfield Scott's Ranch and celebrate holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas. But anyway, everything, again, that meant when you said you were eating out, that meant eating outside. And again, that was important because not only did we not have restaurants or cafes, but in the first 20 or so years of Scottsdale, we had only homes. We had no public facilities other than the schoolhouse, so everything was done al fresco. So finally, the first restaurants to open in the Scottsdale area were at our few guest ranches and resorts. For example, the Ingleside Inn, which was Scottsdale area's first luxury resort, opened in about 1909, close to where the Arizona Country Club is located today. They not only offered fresh food for their seasonal winter guests who usually stayed there for the whole winter and had all 3 meals provided there. One of their specialties was olive-fed or citrus fruit-fed turkey. I don't know exactly how that flavored the turkey meat, but anyway, that was what they used in their ads. And also, Ingleside would cater with white tablecloths, china, crystal, and silverware, elaborate dinners up in Echo Canyon on Camelback Mountain. And they would take all the accoutrements of the dinner as well as the guests by horse and buggy up to have that dinner. And then they would also be entertained with so oftentimes Native Americans doing Native American cultural displays. Jococky Inn opened at the base of Camelback Inn, now where the Phoenician Resort is. It opened as a tea room in 1926 and featured a famous dessert by the owner, Sylvia Evans, and it was called Death by Chocolate. Sounds pretty good to me. I don't know what happened to that recipe, but anyway, that's what it was known for. And that tea room became so popular that 2 years later, that morphed into the Jococky Inn and was a favorite luxury resort for many celebrities for years to come. The building itself still stands on the grounds of the Phoenician Resort, but is no longer used as a restaurant or for overnight accommodations. Graves Guest Ranch was also not only a guest ranch, but a health camp located on the northwest corner of Scottsdale and Indian School Roads. And it featured 3 meals a day for those people that were staying there. And one of their famous specialties was daily made homemade biscuits. And not only were they popular with the guests staying at the guest ranch, but the children of Scottsdale would line up at the back door of the kitchen, hoping that the cook would bring out extras so that the children in Scottsdale could enjoy those biscuits. And that was probably their first taste of not something that mom made at home. Also opened in the 1920s was a guest ranch pretty much right here where the Civic Center Library is, and that was called the Adobe House. It had been a private residence, but in the 1920s it became a guest ranch called the Adobe House, owned and operated by Mildred Bartholow, who was known as a really good cook. Well, in the 1940s, after the United States entered World War II, and most of travel was restricted due to gas rationing and war service, Mildred Bartholow closed the Adobe House and then became the cook at Thunderbird II Airfield's cafeteria. And during the time that 5,500 aviation cadets trained up there at Thunderbird II Airfield, which is now Scottsdale Airport and Air Park, Mildred Bartholow gave them the same kind of gourmet cooking that her guests at the Adobe House knew her from before the war. In the 1930s and 1940s, we not only had our first cafes open, but the first bars opened in Scottsdale. I should have mentioned earlier that although we were known for our fresh produce and meat, we were not known for alcohol because actually we were a dry community from our very founding, being founded by a Baptist minister. In fact, the Arizona Territory's Anti-Saloon League was founded here in Scottsdale, and Scottsdale residents as early as the late 1890s voted to ban alcohol in Scottsdale. So it wasn't until nationwide prohibition was repealed in the 1930s, that we actually had liquor sales and the first bars opened in Scottsdale. It's kind of hard to imagine that now, but that was truly the case in early Scottsdale. One of the first bars to open was at Scottsdale and Thomas Road, which was considered on the outskirts and far south of the downtown, and that was the Scottsdale Tavern. And then the first one that opened right in downtown Scottsdale was Hamer's, which opened on Main Street, and that was not only a bar but a cafe. School children got their first taste of non-mom cooking when the school lunch program started at the Scottsdale Grammar School and Scottsdale High School in about 1923, organized by Clara Beaucamp, who I might mention in 1968 was one of the founders of the Scottsdale Historical Society. But that was another way that people were eating out in those days. So among the first restaurants in Scottsdale, as I mentioned, were Hamer's on Main Street, the Pima Cafe opened on Brown Avenue, Whitey's Cafe opened on Main Street and operated by Malcolm White, a recent high school graduate in the 1940s who went on to be a flight instructor at Thunderbird II Airfield during the war. And then in 1951, when we incorporated, he became Scottsdale's first mayor. But in the late 1930s, early 1940s, he operated a cafe. And then, of course, one of the popular places in Scottsdale was the Palace of Sweets, which offered ice cream and candy of all kinds. One of the restaurants that still is one of Scottsdale's absolute favorites, Los Olivos, actually dates back to when the Corral family and others in Scottsdale's Hispanic community began selling tamales door to door in the 1930s, and also sold their famous tamales at fiestas that were fundraisers to build the old Mission Church. And then years later, those tamales became an important part of the menu that we all love at Los Olivos restaurant, still owned and operated by the Corral family. The foodie 50s are one of the eras that if I could jump into a time machine and could spare the calories, I would go back to. We had a huge population and baby boom in the 1950s, and we also had a new slogan that Malcolm White had coined in the late 1940s, calling Scottsdale the westmost western town. So many of the restaurants that were opening to cater to this population and tourism boom in the 1950s followed a western theme. And places like Lulu Bells, a gay 90s themed Western restaurant, opened on Main Street. I love this ad or this menu that says that the soup du jour was 40 cents. You could get a Caesar salad for two for $1.50. And some of the dining specials, you could get Chateaubriand or rack of lamb for two, served with all of the accompaniments for $16 a couple. So that was a popular watering hole, as was the Pink Pony, opened by Charlie Briley at the same time. And they were actually catty-cornered from each other on Main Street. The Pink Pony at that time was at the southeast corner of Scottsdale and Main Street, and Lulu Bell was across the street on the north side of Main Street. But those were the two main watering holes in the foodie 50s. In fact, it was in 1955 when a group of men were having lunch at the Pink Pony that they decided that we should have spring training here in Scottsdale. The Cactus League had just started with 2 or 3 teams, and they convinced the owner and manager of the Baltimore Orioles that he should bring the Baltimore Orioles here for spring training. But the whole thing was cooked up, no pun intended, at the Pink Pony over a rather liquid lunch in 1955. By November, almost 6 or 7 months later, we had a ballpark, and in February of 1956, the Baltimore Orioles started here. You know, one of the reasons why restaurants really were popular in the 1950s is that unlike the pre-war resort visitors here that stayed for the whole season and ate all of their meals on site at a resort, they were the ones that were coming out by train. But in the 1950s, people wanted to come here in their own cars. Car production was on again after the war, and people were coming just for a week or two and having family vacations in Scottsdale, and they didn't want to have all 3 meals a day at the resorts and hotels where they were staying. So that really gave impetus to many of these restaurants opening. And speaking of people using cars, that was the era when drive-in restaurants became popular. Scottsdale's first drive-in was Bimbo's that opened in 1955. And as kind of a cute aside, that was opened on the former property of Winfield Scott, who we remember was a teetotaling Baptist minister that was very, very proper, although he was beloved and was the founder of many of Scottsdale's industries. But he, I'm sure, would not want to have something that was opened on his property named Bimbo's. But at the time, that was a small chain of fast food hamburger restaurants, and it was followed on that site by several other restaurants, and now is an office building. But that was Scottsdale's first drive-in restaurant. It followed years later, several years later, by some of the restaurant chains like A&W and Dairy Queen. And also during this early period of the foodie 50s, we actually had our first spa or healthy cuisine, and that happened when Elizabeth Arden opened a women's only health spa on the grounds of where the Phoenician is today. It was called Main Chance, and wealthy and celebrity women would come there for a week or two to get healthy. Some of them came to lose weight, others to perhaps had had a really busy season and schedule and were exhausted and were going to benefit by having spa cuisine or healthy eating. But there was one unhealthy aspect during the 1950s that I myself probably wouldn't have enjoyed. Everybody smoked then, so all the restaurants were full of smoke. And I was pretty happy myself, as many of you probably were, when smoking in restaurants was finally completely forbidden, within the last 10 years. So now you can breathe easy going to all restaurants in Arizona. I call the period of the 60s and 70s the scrumptious period in Scottsdale, and this was when we saw a rise in ethnic restaurants as well as fine dining. We had French restaurants like La Chimère on Main Street. We had Chez Louis. We had Caf Casino, which was a chain of restaurants with a French theme that were more like cafeterias. We had Lafitte's and we had Etienne's. We had Italian restaurants like Enrico's at the corner of 2nd Street and Scottsdale Road, a real family popular restaurant. We had Chinese restaurants like China Lil's on Main Street. We had Tang's, and we had Empress Garden, opened by architect Joe Wong on 1st Avenue, catty corner from the Sugar Bowl. And we had Mexican restaurants like Los Olivos, Tico Taco, the Old Corral, and Macayo's. And who can forget our famous Polynesian restaurant that opened in 1962 on 5th Avenue, Trader Vic's, which became the place to go for a pre-prom date, an anniversary celebration, a first date, or any other type of celebration. We also had fine dining at Joe Hunt's, the Palm Court at the Conference Resort, the Chaparral Room at the Camelback Inn, Dale Anderson's, El Chorro, and many others. Also during the 70s, many of you will recall one of our favorite outings was a Sunday brunch at the many resorts where you could hardly waddle out of there. They were so sumptuous. And it was also the time when we all went through salad bars. Now in this era of COVID-19 and takeouts, the thought of going through a salad bar kind of makes us all crazy, but that was really a popular feature that was added to most restaurants during this time. And another phenomena that happened in the 1960s, those scrumptious 1960s, was the advent of coffee houses in Scottsdale and around the country that were popularized with folk singers. And two popular names at that time were Dolan Ellis, who ran the Tuba City truck stop, and actually even our Scottsdale-based Arizona historian Marsh Trimble sang in the Gin Blossom Trio at a coffee house in Scottsdale during that era before he became a popular high school and then college history teacher. Well, all of these restaurants that I talked about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were pretty much alcohol-serving adult restaurants. And so we were wondering, what do you do when you want to take the family out for a meal? Well, this occurred to a new resident who brought his family here from Michigan in 1958. Jack Huntress took his family out for dinner at the Lulu Bell, and he overheard people at the next table kind of tisking because he had brought his children into a bar, but he realized there was no place to take families in those days. So within a couple of months, he leased a property that had been an auto repair shop at the corner of First Avenue and Scottsdale Road, and on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1958, opened an ice cream parlor named the Sugar Bowl. And of course, that still thrives today, where according to its own menu, you can get ooey gooey treats of all kinds. And forget about the calories. The Sugar Bowl is still one of Scottsdale's most beloved restaurants that we really look forward to returning to as soon as our stay-at-home orders are lifted. We also enjoyed ice cream at places called Farrell's, which was on Indian School and Scottsdale Road. We had fast casual restaurants that were family-oriented, Hobo Joe's, the Ranch House, Googie's, and Coco's. We had more drive-in restaurants, and we had family entertainment places like Rawhide on North Scottsdale Road and Pinnacle Peak Road that operated there from 1971 through 2005. And Bobby McGee's, where most of the servers dressed up in costumes and you had your salad out of a big salad bar that was in a rowboat or an old car. Betty Crocker's Treehouse at Scottsdale and Thomas Road was popular with families, as was the King's Buffet in the McDowell corridor. We also had entertaining eateries. We had places like Paul Shank's French Quarter at the Safari Hotel, which also featured a nightclub and had acts like Rosemary Clooney and other famous singers and bands that would entertain in the evenings. We had two sing-along places long before we knew what karaoke was. We had Wild Bill Moses and we had Jed Nolan's, where people would gather for sing-alongs. Rather than one person on the stage doing karaoke, the entire restaurant would be singing the songs along something that was projected on the wall, the words to the songs. We also had places like JD's, where Waylon Jennings got his start, and again, that Tuba City truck stop where Dolan Ellis was the featured entertainer. And how entertaining was it to take a family trip up to Pinnacle Peak Patio and have your tie cut off and pasted in, or stapled into the ceiling. And last but not least, how can we forget the Windmill Dinner Theater? Remember dinner theaters that were so popular in the 1970s and 80s? Where there was a steady stream of famous actors off-season that would star in those performances at the Windmill Dinner Theater. And I personally remember being here in the 1970s and seeing former Hogan's Hero star Bob Crane starring in a feature at the Windmill Dinner Theater. Regrettably, during his time in Scottsdale starring in a production at the Windmill Dinner Theater, he was brutally murdered in his apartment, and that became one of Scottsdale's long-term unsolved mysteries on whodunit. The last thing I want to focus on as far as our restaurants and eating out is the fact that we have been blessed with many culinary events that have brought us all together, many of them to benefit Scottsdale causes. Whether it's a dinner for the boys club, girls club, or a benefit for the Center for the Arts, or many others, we've come together over decades to raise money for all kinds of causes in Scottsdale. We've had an international chili cook-off that was held here in the early 1990s at Rawhide, where the celebrity judges were Ernest Borgnine and Robert Mitchum, joined by our own beloved mayor at the time, Herb Drinkwater. I remember a particular time when I was with the Chamber of Commerce that we had the International, or the Society of American Travel Writers come in, and we took them up to the Marchesa restaurant at the Scottsdale Princess, who made the world's largest pan of paella that was absolutely huge, but also delicious, and we really impressed those travel writers. And then, of course, the Scottsdale League for the Art has sponsored the Scottsdale Culinary Festival every year since 1978, but regrettably, this very weekend in April, as I'm speaking to you, had to cancel it because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we really look forward to that event continuing in the next years, because it raises significant funds to support art organizations in Scottsdale. Again, we are so blessed to be in the middle of an area that has at least 500 restaurants, all with different themes, always at the cutting edge of culinary technology, catering to our varied tastes. And we also have to remember that our restaurateurs have been so generous to local charities, always donating dinners, not only to silent auctions, but also participating in programs like Waste Not, where they send their surplus food in the evenings to local food banks and homeless shelters. And it is a time that we all should remember to support those in the community that may be food insecure by participating in donation drives to Vista del Camino, Scottsdale's food bank, and help those who can't eat out on a regular basis have food for their families. So I hope that you all will celebrate the success of our many past restaurants. Remember those favorites. Oh, and certainly a favorite that just closed a year ago this month, Don and Charlie's, but also so many of the restaurants that thrive today up until a couple of weeks ago when they were asked to only do takeout and delivery service. And we pine for the day, we thirst for the day that we can return to our Scottsdale restaurants, sit down and enjoy a meal, and savor Scottsdale, scrumptious Scottsdale, and return to be the delicious destination that we know and love. See you at the restaurant.